If you're 13 years old or you're 14 years old, somebody should be saying something when you show up and you present to the clerk of the court and they check off a piece of paper and they say, oh, you can get married. 90% of these children who are 13 and 14 years old who are getting married are not marrying somebody who's 14 or 15 years old. They're marrying somebody who's much, much older, sometimes 20 and 30 years older. Well, that is, to me, a really disturbing statistic to read and a disturbing case that Virginia is not doing something about that somebody is not at least stopping to investigate that, or that we don't have some process in the Commonwealth of Virginia, as other states do, where at least a court or a judge or somebody is looking at this and looking at the best interest of the child. So the bill that I brought to the courts committee, which raised a few eyebrows, and frankly was my preference, was just a straight, you got to be 18 to get married. And I understand why that seems onerous and perhaps a little bit of a high standard. And so we went back and we looked at this again, and we came up with the bill that you have before you now. And this bill says you got to be 16 to get married. It sets the floor at 16 with a process for emancipation, and it sets a process where you have to go before a judge, and the judge says, I'm going to look at these factors that consider the best interest of the child and determine whether or not it's in the interest to go through the emancipation process and to allow that child to get married. Otherwise, you have to wait till you're 18 years old. And if you just consider for a minute that Virginia's current law, which would allow you to get married when you're 14 or 15 years old or even 13 years old, if you consider what that means to a child and what risk that poses. And I understand that there may be a circumstance, and we all know great stories of people who got married when they were very young and they go on to live for 50 years and be very happily married, or 70 years to be happily married. But you consider that what the countervailing risk to that child, if you're in high school or you're 14 or 15 or 16 years old, the chances that you're going to finish high school, that you're going to complete your education, that you're going to have a stable household, I mean, it's just not very likely. And so more importantly, when you consider and you look at the statistics about what happens in the cases where many of these young children who are getting married because they're being coerced, and you look at the high rates of violence and sexual assault, and in many cases domestic abuse. And as I was carrying a number of domestic violence bills this session, looking at the statistics related to these very, very young marriages, it was really disturbing. And so I bring this bill to this body in hopes that you will consider that reforming Virginia's current marriage law is a priority for no other reason than it is such an important protection to children. And so with that, Mr. President, I would ask you that the bill pass.
Will the senator from Fauquier rise for a question?
Senator, yield for a question.
I yield, Mr. President.
Mr. President, will the senator answer that it appears to me that in reading this that under 18, a child cannot get married, even with parental consent. You would need to go to court to get an order of emancipation if you're under 18 to get married. Is that what the bill says?
The senator from Fauquier.
Mr. President, that is exactly what the bill says. It sets as a floor 16. You must go to a J&D judge and go through that process of emancipation and have a judge consider the best interest of the child.
Senator from Roanoke City.
Mr. President, what are the standards of the best interest of the child? Is that set forth in this bill?
Would the senator yield for an additional question?
Mr. President, it does list in the bill. It says, if you'll bear with me for 1 second, it lists several things for the court might to consider, whether they're being coerced, if it's not forced or coerced, if they're mature enough to decide to marry, if not endanger the minor, and so forth.
So, Mr. President, speaking to the bill, Mr. President, the record shows I voted against this bill. Nobody supports the rights and protection of children more than I do. Right now, the law is if you're under 18, you can get married with parents' consent. I forget what the floor is. I think if you're under 16, if you're pregnant, I believe it is. But the parents can decide whether their 16, 17-year-old child can get married today. This takes that away. This puts it in the hands of a judge who's not going to know what to do. He doesn't know who these people are. He listens to the evidence. I'm not sure that our juvenile judges want this responsibility, but I also think the parents ought to have that responsibility to decide whether their underage child should get married. And for that reason, I voted against the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. The question is, shall Senate Bill 415 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their votes aye. Those opposed, no. Other senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their votes? The clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 33, noes 7.
Ayes 33, no 7. The bill passes. The